This week on Snark Squad Pod, we're joined by Abby Ryan to talk about Emma by Jane Austen. Welcome back to Snark Squad Pod. My name is Marines.
I'm Nicole Sweeney, and we're joined once again by our good friend Abby.
Hi, I'm Abby. I go by Abby Jean on most platforms, ABIJEAN, except on Twitter, which is ABI_JEAN. But yeah, you can find me Twitter and Instagram.
Abby is here to talk to us about one of my favorite books, Emma by Jane Austen. And as with our Pride and Prejudice episode, we are also talking about the various adaptations of Emma in addition to the novel itself. The story of Emma is that of Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever, and rich, who is a very well-off young woman who, in addition to being basically the most important woman in her neighborhood, which is something of a divergence for Jane Austen protagonists, she also is fairly unchecked in kind of all areas of her life. And so in addition to being very well off, she's also pretty and smarter than most of the people in her social circle. As Jane Austen describes it, has the problem of having rather too much her own way. And really the only person in her life who ever finds any sort of fault with Emma is her neighbor and brother-in-law, Mr. Knightley. At the beginning of the story, Emma's governess and friend gets married and becomes Mrs. Weston. And in search of a new friend, Emma decides to take a girl from a local boarding school under her wing and, help her establish herself in higher society than she belonged to prior to meeting Emma. And Emma is a matchmaker. Emma decides that she is the one who is responsible for her governess's marriage, and she is going to help Harriet get married. And many shenanigans ensue. Emma first tries to set Harriet up with Mr. Elton, the vicar, but that ends disastrously. She later tries to set Harriet up with Mrs. Weston's son-in-law, Frank Churchill, after first believing herself to be in love with Frank Churchill. And it's basically the story of Emma being wrong a lot and meddling in other people's business and learning after being wrong a bunch to, maybe mind her own business. Also, she and Mr. Knightley fall in love. That's a thing. That's the romance novel part of this. But I would contend that this is, in a lot of ways, in spite of having a lot of romance plots woven throughout, this is less of a romance novel than most of Jane Austen's books. More than anything, this is Emma's coming of age story, and right. Mr. Knightley's her relationship with Mr. Knightley is in service of her coming into a sense of self-awareness that she does not possess at the beginning of the novel.
Which is probably why he's more like her dad than her love interest. But we will get to that. I want to start actually with not only asking you guys if you like this. Nicole already spoiled that it's her favorite. But just give the people a quick rundown of you and Jane Austen and how you came about to her novels, what you think of her novels in general, and how Emma fits in with that. And we'll start with Abby.
I was familiar with Jane Austen's stories before I was familiar with the actual books. So, I saw Pride and Prejudice, the movie, the Keira Knightley movie, well before I ever tried to read the book. And in the same way, my introduction to Jane Austen was actually the Pemberley Digital series, so Lizzie Bennet Diaries and Emma Approved, and ultimately was no, I want to know more about these stories in the actual context they were written, and tried to read Pride and Prejudice and actually really didn't like it, really, really didn't like it to the point where I didn't finish it, which is not normal for me. And I think it was just because it was my first time trying to read, I guess, basically a book from that era. But then I listened to the audiobook of Emma and devoured it, just listened to it so quickly, so fast. And it's definitely one of my favorite stories, and immediately was I need to find all of the different adaptations I can find. And yeah, so my experience would be trying to find all of the ways to hear the story that I could. But also, I really like Pride and Prejudice in other adaptations, and I know you guys have done an episode on that. This book I liked a lot.
First of all, I will say, again, I have to once again sing the praises of the Rosamund Pike audiobook of Pride and Prejudice. So, like, if you struggle with Pride and Prejudice, you gotta give that a shot. That being said, as much as I now love Jane Austen, that description of having a hard time with it at first without having a lot of experience with novels of that era is totally something that I can relate to, because I did not come to Jane Austen in class. I came to it by myself when I was about 20. I read almost all of her books kind of in quick succession. And I remember having a little bit of that feeling of barrier to entry, I guess. Mostly I remember this sense of nothing happens. That was definitely my immediate reaction. Emma is my favorite in large part because it's the book that made me get it, which is a little bit, I don't know. There are things that she's doing in Emma, like things about the writing in Emma that I love, that I don't think entirely exist anywhere in any of the other books that she has written. But reading Emma and getting to the end of Emma and seeing all of the ways in which the writing was just fucking with me, and we're being told this story through Emma's very warped and distorted lens, even though it's in the third person. And I don't know, at the time that I read this book, it had been a while since I had taken an English class. And so it was a very instructive experience for me in understanding a thing that a book was doing. That I opened it and I thought, okay, yes, here is third person narration. So this is these are the facts. This is the capital T truth of what is happening, right? And I don't remember how far into the book I got before I was oh, no, that's not what's happening. This is a really warped and distorted perspective of what's happening. And also Jane Austen is really funny. And so Emma forever holds a very special place in my heart as being the book that made me understand how to read and appreciate Jane Austen. And I don't know, she's so flawed, and she experiences so much actual growth over the course of the story, and I really love that. I have found, though, that because of my love of the writing in Emma, I don't have quite the same level of appreciation for the adaptations that I do for a lot of the Pride and Prejudice adaptations, in part because there's something very specific to the writing rather than just the story that makes me love Emma in particular.
You guys already know I'm a Pride and Prejudice super fan. So basically, I did come to Pride and Prejudice when I was in my teenage years, but it wasn't for school necessarily. I was in the middle of reading all of the, sometimes dense and, I don't know, dowdy classics that they make you read in school. And I picked up Pride and Prejudice for the accelerated reader program, but it was my own choice. I didn't have to read it. And I had a very opposite experience that in coming to Jane Austen in the middle of some other required reading, it really gave me a sense of how what she was doing was funnier and more entertaining and more accessible. And I absolutely loved it. So I've been reading Pride and Prejudice at least once a year since I was 15 years old. And so it's been with me for over half my life. I did not ever read another Jane Austen until well into my 20s. And I picked up Sense and Sensibility, Mansfield Park, and I think those two or in Persuasion, in my mid-20s. And then last year, I finally read and hated Northanger Abbey, and that was 2 years ago. And then last year, I finally picked up Emma. So I've now read all of Jane Austen's works, even though I've been reading Pride and Prejudice since I was 15. But obviously, I love her stories. I love her writing. I mean, even Northanger Abbey, I get what she was trying to do there. It just wasn't my favorite thing. So I don't know. There's something about her wit and her style that I really appreciate. Emma was very tough for me in the beginning, to the point that I was sending messages to Nicole why do you like this? But I think that the problem is, or it's not a problem, but Jane Austen is doing that on purpose. And And, she's making a character that she famously said, nobody's going to like her but myself, basically. So she did that very intentionally. And you go into the story with loud and wrong Emma. And for somebody who suffers very badly from secondhand embarrassment, and I was just suffering with the story for a large part of it. So it was really rough going for me, but I actually stopped reading it and went and watched adaptations. And so in spoiling myself, essentially, and watching the adaptations, I then went back and restarted the book and then could appreciate everything that Austen was then dangling in front of me narratively. And so I ended with a much more positive kind of feeling towards this story. And I think that it's super interesting, even though I don't know that if it will ever reach my favorite levels like Persuasion and Pride and Prejudice. I think that this is probably her most clever book. The narration is like a whole piece of it in and of itself. But I think my big critique of it is that Pride and Prejudice has the same, not quite to the same level, but it has a lot of that same humor. It is very tongue-in-cheek about like social norms and about, women and men in that time period. But if you take that away, you have a story that is obviously still standing and it can be adapted in so many ways. And it is very relatable and people love it. And you can translate that to other mediums. If you take the narration away from Emma, we see often in the adaptations that you're left with something that's okay, but it's not, I don't think that this story necessarily succeeds away from that like clever narration and the way that Jane Austen is like leading us along. So, I liked it. It's good, and I will continue to reread it a lot.
I would push back on that a little bit because I think that there is something in like the characters that she's created, and I agree with you in part. The narration is so much a part of the thing that. Again, like that's why I have not always loved all of the adaptations of this in quite the same way that I have loved most of the adaptations of Pride and Prejudice, because a lot of them lose. There's something lost when you take away that that narration. But I also think that there is a lot in the characters, and I don't think it's impossible, as we'll get to, I think at some point, I don't think it's impossible to capture some of what the narration is doing. Nor do I think, like, I take your point about Pride and Prejudice, the story, but I also don't, like, it's a different book. I don't know. I reject the premise that the narration, that like, oh, it's just narration and like the story is flimsy. I don't know. Like that is as a premise, I don't buy it.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that. I mean, I'm not saying to that extreme. I'm not saying it's flimsy. I'm comparing them in my feelings. You know what I mean? Like just to compare them to myself, and what it's doing. I think that the reason that I will, apart from having read it forever and ever, and it just being like my first Austen and all of that, I think there's something to Pride and Prejudice that is both narration and story, and like all of these pieces where, I don't know, they're so interwoven in Emma. Not that it's impossible to do or that the story is very flimsy, but I think it all very heavily relies on it being like an entire package, if that makes sense.
No, yes, that absolutely makes sense to me. To me, that is like why I love it. But right. that I totally buy.
Speaking, I guess we'll start here, but let's talk a little bit about what makes Emma Emma, and the narration and the style here. What is it, do you think, that makes this what it is? We've said a couple times, like, it's clever, it's witty, but I don't know. Let's dig into that.
I guess what makes Emma Emma, I'll stick with that. There's like this balance between self-awareness and just complete lack of self-awareness at these very strange times. Like she can be so good with people, but also be so bad at seeing some things that like other people would end up seeing. And I think there's like a good heart buried beneath this, like, this girl who just needs to grow up a little bit, and kind of experience some things. Like, she doesn't leave Highbury very, like, at all. And that's the whole Box Hill thing. So I don't know. There's kind of this sense of like she hasn't had a lot of like worldly experience or whatever.
She's incredibly sheltered.
Yeah. Like she cares so much about the people that she cares about. And so she has kind of this really good way of dealing with that. But at the same time, when things kind of challenge that life that she's had, she's not very good at dealing with it.
I think that one of the things, as I was struggling with this at the beginning, and I sent Nicole that message of, why do you like this? The thing that she said to me was, and I think it reframed a lot of how I viewed Emma, was about her caring for people so deeply. And even though she is loud and wrong, like where she's coming from is essentially a good place. And I think reframing her actions in that way really helped me with Emma. And when you look at what she's trying to do, like she's trying to find people matches, and she's trying to encourage Harry in a way that says that she can marry above her station, basically, that she's good enough to do so. And so I can't quarrel with that, you know, and especially in like, if you look at it in the time period where it was written, for Austen to have created a heroine who is basically telling another, you can marry above your station. I mean, in the end, she doesn't, but like Emma is trying to encourage her in that direction. And yes, she might not be picking up on like the clues that other people are giving her, and she's making the wrong decisions. But I don't know. She's really trying. And I think that framing it in that way helps you understand who Emma is as a character.
Yeah, and all of her poor judgments, to Abby's point about like there's a ton of self-awareness, there's overall lacks self-awareness, but she also at the same time does have a peculiarly acute sense of other people in some places. And it is, like a very weird balance of very strong awareness or no awareness. Like those are her two modes. And but the thing is that the places where she has no awareness, the reason that she has no awareness is that she has so much bias in the favor of the people that she cares about that it like that is almost always like when she lacks awareness in a situation, like when she's missing something, it's because she's so attached to certain people. For the most part, I would say the big exception is her one very pronounced negative prejudice against Jane Fairfax is probably the one place where she's missing things for kind of the opposite reason. But by and large, she's missing things for like very good-hearted reasons, and like ultimately she has a view of herself as being very like good and helpful and whatever, and obviously we see her being very much not that for the better part of the novel. But like as she realizes that her intentions are so far removed from the actual consequences, like she does work to rectify that, and like she wants to. It's not just that she like wants to fancy herself good and like not actually be good. So I don't know. I think there's a ton in this very, very flawed heroine that I find incredibly charming.
I think what I was getting at with my original question, and Abby, you put it as being like self-aware and not aware at the same time. But I think what helps that is that the narration in this, like I always think about this as Emma's story, obviously, but the narration is not coming directly from her. It is omniscient almost, like, and it then becomes very self-aware.
Free indirect style, if you want to get all literary scholar about it.
It is free indirect style, which means that like the narrator then almost becomes a character. And as the character of the narrator is telling you the story, and she opens up a little bit more of your understanding and your view of Emma, then you get that bit of awareness on top of Emma's self-awareness. So it's a very neat balance that it creates.
There is a really fantastic Guardian article that was written on the 2015 was like the 200th anniversary of Emma being published. So there's if you like searching for people writing about Emma, there's a bunch of stuff from 2015, and there's a Guardian article that I will link in the blog post. To this point about the narration, he says the novel bent the narration through the distortions of its protagonist's mind, and like that's like I don't know, that's like the most succinct way to describe, I think, the thing that the narration is doing that I found so compelling upon first read, and that I still get so much out of every time I reread. There are all these little, like all the little places where the cracks in the distortions are showing through if you know what to look for. And I think that makes this particularly fun as a reread.
I think what I also liked about the story and about Emma and her character is that you get the beats that the novel hits is really interesting. Like you get her pushing Harriet on Mr. Elton, and that doesn't pan out. And she's very she's contrite. She's like, oh man, I shouldn't have done that. But she doesn't actually learn her lesson the first time around. No. So it's something that I can totally see why people reading her get annoyed with her, but also that is so human. Like who actually learns their lesson the first time,
and she tries to learn the lesson too. Like she thinks she's learned it, you can see her thinking about it repeatedly. Like, I'm totally not going to do that, but like she's going to fucking do that.
And she's also like, she's still warring with a sense of like, she wants what's best. And now she's hurt Harriet because of pushing this thing on her. And she really wants what's best for Harriet. And so she's trying to learn this lesson, but at the same time, still fighting this like, I'm blind because of how much I care about these people.
That's another thing that I really do appreciate about this story. I kind of said as much in my plot synopsis that so Mr. Knightley is one of my favorite Austen love interests, and yet I the love story feels almost incidental to me in a way. Obviously it's the thing that we come to at the end and whatnot, but I don't know, most of this story is all of Emma's various friendships and the dynamics of her different friendships, and her friendship with Harriet, the differences, the acute differences between her friendships with Mrs. Weston and Harriet, I think frame a lot of this story.
Yeah, I almost see Emma as trying to take on the role of Mrs. Weston. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like a transfer. So she's like, this person has done so much for me, has brought me up. And so now I'm going to do this for someone else.
Yeah, she has a thought more or less to that effect early on in her friendship with Harriet. That's basically for Mrs. Weston, Harriet is not going to replace Mrs. Weston as my friend. That's not even possible. I don't want anyone to do that. But whereas for Mrs. Weston, nothing can be done. For Harriet, everything can be done. And that's the mindset that she goes into that friendship with, which is, flawed for lots of reasons, but that's where she's at.
So a lot of these things that we're talking about that we pick up, after having consumed Emma multiple times, I think it's just super interesting that in a lot of ways where Emma is making these rash decisions and she's doing things that we as the reader are perceiving as wrong and are wrong in a lot of instances, this novel has a way of framing the whole story that also puts us in the same shoes as Emma almost, in that I was making these rash decisions about what was actually going on, and I was also wrong. I was also wrong about what was happening. So it's really interesting, especially when people still end the novel and kind of hold on to that idea of Emma being unlikable and because she was so wrong. Because I think what Austen is trying to do is in turn show us by putting us in the same shoes, in the same seat, that it
you
can happen
wrong
to anyone. Right. You thought you knew better, right? You thought you were more clever than anybody in the story. You thought you saw where this was going. But like Emma, you were wrong.
I think that's what's interesting about so many adaptations too, is there's a lot of times where they make a nod to what the actual truth is, and so you don't have that experience. sometimes, like of you being wrong as well. And so that's a little frustrating to be like, well, they're making it seem super obvious and making Emma seem super wrong when maybe it wasn't that, clean and cut.
That is one of the, I think, two biggest problems that I have with most adaptations of Emma, like just in general, the presentation of objectivity, which is not necessary. Like there are ways that you can get around that, but there is definitely in the adaptations a much stronger presentation of like this is the truth of the story. These are the things as they happened, like sans any sort of distortion. And I alluded to this previously, so I will now just come out and say Clueless is, I think, in addition to being like a truly flawless and delightful movie in its own right, Clueless is really fantastic as an adaptation of Emma because it manages to achieve a lot of those narrative distortions, in part through all of like the voiceover. Like there are a number of things that Clueless the movie is doing to also get at some of the perspective distortions of like seeing the world through Cher's perspective in a lot of the ways that Jane Austen forces you to see these events through Emma's perspective. And I think that some of that is lost in the way that some of the adaptations play out. And like the second half of that, and this is also true with Clueless and with the voiceover, is this tonal thing that we talked about before in terms of the narration, because of like the narration being so wrapped up in everything that I love about this story. Like when you take away the narration, I do often find that something is lost. And so again, like the way that Clueless uses the voiceover also manages to replicate some of that very effectively.
In the book, too, it's interesting because Emma isn't the only one who is wrong. And I think that kind of gets lost sometimes in the adaptations as well. Like, even Mr. Knightley makes snap judgments about Harriet at the beginning and is like kind of like poo-pooing on her. And then, but then kind of gets to know her and talks to her a little bit and then admits like, yeah, she's a fine gal. Like, that's fine,
She's aight.
she's cool. She's amiable or whatever it is. And then, Frank Churchill acts in ways that are super wrong at points. So there are a lot of people in the story.
Mrs. Weston also is very wrong about Mr. Knightley and Jane Fairfax. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So there are a lot of, and then you have like her father like going on about birthday cake and who knows what, and just being like wrong about people's happiness. So he didn't even want Miss Weston to get married. He doesn't want Emma to get married. So he's doing a fair bit of that projection as well. So that, you have all of these people and it kind of softens Emma's wrongness because of being sheltered and, everybody is making mistakes.
There's also the secret genius of the novel, Miss Bates, who, like, in her long passages of nonsense, frequently, like, that's another thing that's, like, fun on reread, is to, like, pay very close attention to the Miss Bates long ramblings, because frequently there's, like, a half a sentence in there about, like, and Frank was so obliging. Like, why would Frank have been, like, like an acknowledgement that, like, of the ways that Frank was contriving to be at their home and whatever. So
I swear we're going to get to adaptations because you already brought up the best one, Clueless. But the final thing I just want to kind of touch on before we move on to adaptations is the romance between Emma and Knightley, which we've mentioned a little bit here and there. And I think you said that Knightley was your favorite Jane Austen hero.
I love him.
Okay.
I love him.
Same.
Okay, so let's discuss.
I love their romance is definitely, like, there is an awkwardness to reading it now, like the age gap and like the family, like the dynamics, all of those things like are real, and I understand why those are, like, that is a barrier to entry to the story for a modern reader, and I don't fault anyone that, and like if that's a thing that like you just can't get past, I get it, and that's cool. I don't know. I don't have that problem. But also, like, the thing that I like about their relationship in particular, I don't know. Like, I like the fact that he is aware that she is flawed. I really appreciate his awareness of the fact that she is flawed. And like, I don't think that, he makes his like speech about, I have scolded you and you've borne it and whatever, but like, he's not mean, like he's right when he's telling her about how wrong she is, but like, and so like the fact that he has such a clear-eyed view of her like in his love for her is, I don't know. I appreciate that and I like it a lot.
Yeah, there's just so much history behind them, and you're so used to seeing these stories that are just like, oh, they've met and suddenly they're in love. And it feels so good to read a story where it's like, no, these two characters know each other so well. They know their flaws, they know their strengths, and like, yeah, Knightley's not afraid to call her out on things, and like she respects his opinion and he respects her opinion, and I don't know. It's
the opposite of insta love. That's yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. It just makes sense to me.
Yes.
He also is like really great about how he just hangs out kind of in the background for most of the story, and like coming in and be like, Emma, that's stupid. Don't do that. And like going off and then coming back and be like, Emma, you're still doing the wrong thing. But there is like a lack of like pushiness there in the story and from him as a character in general. And it makes the story mean that, we're exploring so much about Emma, her coming of age, her friendships, and he is hanging out in the wings until the appropriate moment. And then he's like, yeah, I've been here all along. So something about like that story, that love story is really sweet too. And it is definitely more of a like less romanticized, like, poor girl meets rich guy, or, we had each other wrong all along. Like those are, fluffier almost stories. And then just like, hey, we've been friends forever. And also you finally, like you've realized that you've liked me and I've liked you all this time. Let's do it kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a robust relationship.
Yeah, all of these things. This is another one too that like again to all of the like the little things that the story is seeding. I can't talk about this book without talking about rereading it like over and over and over again. Like if you can track the sort of general timeline, like at the end of the book he says that it's around the time that Frank Churchill finally comes to Highbury that he starts to realize that like, oh, like I can lose Emma. Wait, that means maybe I have feelings for Emma, and like that whole thing. And so knowing that, there are a number of really lovely little moments. One of my favorites is when Emma finally confronts him about whether or not he has feelings for Jane Fairfax. And he blushes when she brings it up. And like there are a number of things in this conversation that's like he is being asked by the woman that he like thinks he's in love with if he is in love with someone else, and he's like trying to like navigate. And after he answers like, no, I'm not in love with her, like she's too reserved, Emma is ready to like move the conversation back to what they were talking about, which at this point in time was Jane's relationship with Mrs. Elton. She's like, how can Jane put up with Mrs. Elton, who is the worst? And even though Emma and Mrs. Weston go back to discussing this dynamic between Jane and Mrs. Elton, like Knightley is not done, and like the end of this, like the chapter ends with him continuing to talk about, Jane is like lacks all of the open countenance that I would want, and like describes Emma, like, and it's just this like very sweet little moment that's easy to miss without knowing what you're looking for.
The age gap is definitely something that is, like you said, a barrier to entry to them, but I think that it's going to sound like I'm forgiving the age gap. Or his comment about being in love with her since she was 13.
That's the one moment.
Yeah.
As an Emma stan, it's the one moment where the book makes me go, oh, no.
So, as an Emma stan, I'm not, like, this is going to sound so bad, but I'm going to commit to saying this. The barrier to entry thing is like an Austen thing in general. Like, you can't read any of her books and not be super aware that they are a product of their time in terms of like dowries, and everybody's super, into marrying their daughters off. And like for as forward thinking as Jane was, for her time, they are still products of their time, and that's true across the board. And the like moment, I was prepared for the comments because you were like, oh, this is the one thing that the whole
knowing that you were going through it like for the first time, it was the anxiety about like, oh no.
But the whole paragraph, like not excusing this thing of falling in love with children or anything, but he was joking throughout most of it. Like he's saying in that whole paragraph, I don't know, it's just a very jokey thing about how he has seen all of her flaws for all of this time. You know, it just in context, it didn't really seem to me like he was saying like, I've loved you since I was 13, especially not in the romantic sense, especially because we are told through the narration that he doesn't really realize his feelings for her until Frank Churchill comes into town. So I think it's almost, I don't know, it's a weird thing. Don't fall in love with children. I'm not excusing that.
Not endorse. Yeah.
I'm not endorsing that. In the context, I think that he's being a little jokey.
Yes.
That's all I gotta say. Okay. Are we good? Adaptations.
Let's do some adaptations.
Let's do it. I want to start. I was thinking about how to like split this up, and you know, I don't know if we've seen all of the same ones, but I'm going to guess that we have. But I want to start with the way that I'll split them up is adaptations that are more true to the story versus modernizations.
Okay.
So we'll talk about first adaptations, which there is the 1996 Emma starring Gwyneth Paltrow. There are 6 TV adaptations that happened between 1948 and 1972 that I don't think any of us have seen any of.
Nope, I have not.
There is a 1996 ITV TV movie starring Kate Beckinsale that I just recently discovered existed, and I saw one YouTube clip and I noped my way out of.
Yeah, same. I wonder if it's the same one.
The 2009 4-part BBC miniseries. So I think we're really talking about here 1996 Gwyneth Paltrow, 2009 BBC miniseries. Yes.
Yeah. Yes, yep. Those are the only ones that I have seen in full.
Okay. Feelings?
So I feel like bad saying this because the cast is so wonderful and it's like a fairly faithful adaptation. But I find the 1996 Gwyneth Paltrow movie terribly boring. And I don't know why. I can't justify or defend this position. I just am like, I'm bored through most of the experience. And this is a story that I love. And like all of the casting is amazing. But for some reason, I'm just like, no.
I don't feel like for that movie, Gwyneth Paltrow was the Emma I wanted. I feel like for all of the adaptations, how much I liked it was entirely carried on her and her interpretation of the character, or I guess the actress's interpretation. Right. But yeah, I also felt that it definitely didn't have the energy in a shorter format than like the 4-part BBC series did.
I don't know what to say about Gwyneth Paltrow being boring because she is, like, her version of it is boring, but there is something like, I don't know, it's just doing the thing very straightforward, but there is a lack of like spark there or stakes or excitement. It's just, I don't know what to say. And I think it's like generally well received.
Yes. I briefly tried to, like, I was like looking at reviews. I was like, I gotta be prepared to have a more articulate like commentary on this movie than just, I don't know, man, it's boring. And so I was reading reviews and like generally speaking, like it's beloved. And so I'm like, okay, I don't know what to say. It's not for me. And I don't really have anything more thoughtful to say than I find this movie surprisingly boring.
Well, I guess for 3 of us in this conversation who have already admitted that part of what we love about Emma is kind of like the snarky, witty narration, it makes sense to me that this version would be boring. Right. You know, like, but I very much prefer the BBC miniseries. I'm not only saying this because I always prefer
so this is a
the more content to the least content.
Yeah, I also much prefer the BBC miniseries. I mean, I think the BBC miniseries also still suffers from some of the problems of like failing to capture a number of the things that I love most about the novel. Like, I think it still winds up being fairly straightforward, but I enjoy it much more. more. I do think it's a little bit, I don't know. I find it slightly more charming than the movie,
Yes.
which like makes up for a little bit of that straightforwardness. As much as I can appreciate a lot of the casting in the 1996 movie, like the cast of the BBC version is fantastic, and like Johnny Lee Miller as Mr. Knightley is like flawless.
Perfect.
Chef's kiss.
The badly done scene is like...
The badly done scene. It kills me. There's like the way that he approaches her in that moment is like, it has the air of he like rehearsed before walking up to her. Like it's just like it's a 30-second exchange, but like the delivery of that performance is just so perfect, and I love it.
I feel like the BBC one captured the humor better. And I feel like that's, for me, the big... The thing I keep coming back to is, like, this phrase in my head is bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. It's dumb, but, like, that to me is, like, the difference in the portrayals of the characters. Like, specifically Emma and Harriet, I feel like there's this energy to it that I feel like Emma has. Like, Emma has this energy.
In addition to those adaptations, we do have a couple of modernizations to talk about. We've already mentioned 1995's Clueless, starring Alicia Silverstone. And then there's also 2013's Emma Approved, which was a web series started by the same people who brought us the Lizzie Bennet Diaries. I had not watched Emma Approved prior to the recording of this. I watched it this week, actually. I binged the entire thing. And I mean, I have feelings about that, but I think maybe first we'll start with Clueless is the best one. The best adaptation out of any of these, hands
Clueless,
down.
the best one or the best one? Discuss. Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to fight you on that particular stance. I already said this, so I like at this point it's repeating myself, but I was surprised by how good it is, both just like as a movie in its own right. Like, it's legitimately fantastic, and we need to all discuss Clueless more, like, in our lives. We need to be talking about how great this movie is. But like, also, we talk a lot on this podcast about different adaptations, and I think it's really interesting that this story that is a modernization that like definitely left a bunch of plot chunks behind in that modernization. Like, there are some really significant divergences, obviously, from the novel. I also feel like, in a lot of ways, it is a more faithful adaptation than either of the other two that we've already discussed, because of the way that it captures like the spirit of the thing.
This is my first time watching Clueless when I rewatched it for the purpose of this episode after having read Emma, which I think is why I'm so like fixated on talking about how the best this is, because I had only previously enjoyed it as like a great, funny movie, like standalone. But having now read Emma and seen other adaptations and then reconsuming Clueless, you're absolutely right about how they capture the spirit of the story, and it's in so many like little things, the voiceovers and having that bit of narration, who Cher is as a character, and that same kind of like bright-eyed, bushy-tailed kind of thing, and just like the way she talks without really knowing what she's saying, but she's trying really hard, and things of that nature I thought were just great. And I think that one thing that this captures that is kind of different from the other modernization, Emma Approved, is that it maintains a lot of like the class stuff, which is so important in the original Emma, that I understand why you would remove that if you're moving your story forward and making it modern. However, the way that it kept it and setting it in Beverly Hills and seeing that aspect of money still come and play into it, I thought was incredibly smart.
And also like high school, using high school as like its own sort of like caste system comparable, like that. Yes. It's a really, really smart way to keep intact something that is very fundamental to the story, but that is like, it's hard to modernize. Like that it is true that it is hard to modernize that component of the story. But I also think like it's hard to tell the story without it.
Yeah, that's the thing that I keep coming back to. Like, that's what I think the other adaptation that we're going to talk about suffers from, is like having to figure out how to bring this part this like class aspect into something that still makes sense. And I think, yeah, Clueless for sure makes you feel that without it feeling, I don't know, dated or out of place.
Mm-hmm. I think that we talked about Emma being sheltered, the character being sheltered, and how that plays into a lot of who she is. And, you know, her privilege of being the person who is of most import in the whole neighborhood. Like, you know, she's highest on the social ladder. That is like her truth and what she was brought up into. I think it informs a lot of who Emma is, and it almost gives you a way to be more forgiving of her because you understand those circumstances. So when you have Emma Approved, which only kind of pays some brief lip service to the fact that Emma, you know, she started her business with her father's money. That's kind of like the most that we really get in that. Then you still have all of Emma's same behaviors without any of that context, and you lose some of that like entry point to being more forgiving to Emma.
You also make her literally Harriet's boss.
Yes.
Just like, wow.
Right. And for no amount of like, but we're friends, changes the fact that no, you are her boss. So I don't know. As much as I struggled with reading Emma when I was reading it, this was like doubled down on Emma Approved. And I don't know how I feel about the experience overall because the beginning was so rough.
I really, really liked Emma Approved when I first watched it. But it was also before I read the book and saw any of the rest of the things. And so having now rewatched it for this, I definitely feel where there are lots of places where things went wrong. I think for me, Knightley was the strongest character in Emma Approved, but I found myself getting really, really frustrated with Emma and not feeling that same sort of, the same fondness as I do for the book Emma and the BBC Emma.
I also thoroughly enjoyed Emma Approved as it was like being uploaded. I think from the jump, it suffered from not having quite as satisfying a conceit as Lizzie Bennet Diaries did. Like the idea of Lizzie as a vlogger, like that just made a lot more sense than the whole documentary thing in Emma Approved, which is just like total nonsense. Like, just like, what are you, I don't know, just a level of like airing other people's stuff, which also, I mean, Lizzie Bennet Diaries, rewatching it as much as I loved that when it was uploading, like that isn't like, there are definitely moments in Lizzie Bennet Diaries that are like, ooh, that's definitely inappropriate for you to be sharing those things. And like where Lizzie Bennet Diaries has a handful of moments like that, Emma Approved is like exclusively moments like that. Like it's just a lot of her sharing other people's business in this way that's like not, I mean, yes, it's meant to be, this is like archival footage, I guess, that like is being shared later. I don't know. Like the conceit doesn't make any sense, first of all. But like also, there are just some boundary things that are really, really flawed about it. That's like a significant problem with it, particularly coming to it later. I will say, like I have a certain soft spot and appreciation for it because I was watching it when it was uploading, and because like the idea of all of the Pemberley Digital shows was really neat and exciting when it was happening. And so I don't know. And I do like, I like a lot of the cast, even though like Emma is frustrating because of the way she is written, but like Joanna Sotomayor's performance as Emma is like, I like her, you know?
Yes.
So I go kind of back and forth on that. But my appreciation of Emma Approved is very much bound to, one, my love of Emma, the story itself, and two, being part of the experience of watching the thing as it was uploading and like, you know, following them on Twitter and like that whole like the transmedia thing. All of that stuff was very, very cool. And so it lets the thing live on in my feelings in a nostalgic sort of way that like doesn't hold up to any sort of real scrutiny, but like I can appreciate it, but also I like it has so many problems.
Yeah. I will say, the thing rewatching it that I did really like, and maybe, you know, this isn't as true to the original story, but I liked more of what they did with Harriet, not in specifically her relationship to Emma, but like as a person and her growth as her own like confident human. I really appreciated that storyline.
In much the same way that like Lydia finally got her due in Lizzie Bennet Diaries, like Harriet, the best portrayal of Harriet is an Emma approved.
I think that part of like the experience of maybe watching it while it was uploaded, like the opposite of that is that binging it was not. I probably needed like a week in between each 4-minute episode to recover from what I had just seen, and I was not giving myself a week. I was just starting the next one and getting more and more frustrated. And the Lizzie Bennet Diaries did the same thing. But I don't know why, to me, it didn't work as well in Emma. And it's the fact that we were getting a lot of the plot action in summary. We weren't watching any of it happen. And so I think that there's some of that, like, feeling bad for Emma or being on her side, or that you can get through watching it all go down, versus just being told what happened. So, just hearing that she was mean to somebody or hearing that, she did this thing that was wrong, that kind of, I don't know, it stripped a little something away. And I get that's part of the format, but that's also part of why I don't think Emma worked as well in this format.
We didn't even talk about, we got to adaptations, but I didn't even mention my fanfic corner. I have to have I gotta have my fanfic corner.
I forgot how our jingle went.
Yeah. But my thing with Emma in particular, the thing that like really stands out to me, Mari and I talk about Pride and Prejudice a lot, as each of us are going through various rereads of like, here's the character that I'm currently distressed with, whatever. But like with Emma in particular, it's like the same thread that like I latch onto over and over again. The thing that like really guts me and my like fanfic is one in which Emma pays Jane her due much sooner and they actually become friends. That like Emma swallows her pride and becomes Jane's friend much earlier. And like, I mean, obviously the whole novel doesn't happen in that. Like that's like what happens is then is Jane's friend rather than like Harriet's friend, and is perhaps let into Jane's confidence and is able to help them keep their secret but like I understand for the sake of the novel why this has to happen, but also my heart just wants Emma and Jane to be friends. And it's like the thing that is so, I don't know, the one thing that is particularly unsatisfying to me at the end is that after everything that's happened, like they can be friendly and there's no enmity there now, but like at the same time, they're never going to be the kind of friends that, as Emma acknowledges repeatedly throughout the novel, they could and should have been by virtue of their ages and relative situations in Highbury. So that's my fanfic corner. Jane Fairfax and Emma Woodhouse, BFF.
I think it's back to Emma approved, but in its favor, I totally felt for Jane in that adaptation because all she wanted to do was her damn job without a camera in her face. And I was like, yeah, I feel you, Jane. That's fair. But also, I think it's just super funny to consider like the one-sided mostly contest there. Well, I don't know. Jane does get jealous of the whole Frank thing, but we were talking about Emma being like at the top of the like social hierarchy, and just hearing about another person who's really accomplished, like, and what that does to her entire worldview. And she's like, oh, I hate this person. Like I have to constantly hear about somebody who is also doing good things. Right. I don't know. It just like doesn't compute in her mind, which is funny, but also it would have been better had they been friends.
That is another one of those things that stands out to me as something that I get why other people are put off by Emma, but also is something that I really love and enjoy. But like this idea that it's not even just, okay, hearing about somebody else who's great, but it's specifically the fact that Jane Fairfax's excellence reminds Emma of the degree to which she doesn't do shit. Like, like the degree to which she has sort of unearned appreciation. Like she knows it and there's a bit about how she like doesn't practice anything that much, but she's also like not gonna stop anybody from believing that she is better at things than she actually is. And like the reason that Jane Fairfax bothers her so much is because Jane Fairfax is actually great in all of the ways that people merely believe Emma to be. But Emma, because she is like smarter than most of these people, knows that she's not as great as they're giving her credit for being. And like, I don't know, something about that dynamic. I just, I appreciate it.
By just existing, Jane Fairfax makes Emma face her privilege. And as the internet will give testimony to, nobody likes to face their privilege. So you can't hate on Emma, people. And on that note, we have come to the end of another episode. Thank you to Abby for joining us this week, and thank you all for listening. We'd love to hear all of your thoughts on Emma and all of its adaptations. There will be a post dedicated to this episode up on SnarkSquad.com. You can also sign up to join our community on Patreon.com/SnarkSquad, and there you can find polls, live hangouts, and other bonus content. You can also find us on Twitter at @Snark_Squad. You can find me at My Name is Marines.
I am at Sweeney Says.
And I am at Abby Jean, ABI_JEAN.
Thank you, as always, to Stefan Chin for the theme music that is playing us out right now. And we will be back in your feed next week. Bye.
Bye.